questions, if questions occur to you as we go along, please put them in the chat and they will be monitored, and we will give them attention when we get to the discussion session at the end. So our intention this afternoon is to give you an overview of the methods that are available to implement within household selection and self-completion surveys. And we're going to present you with the findings from an experimental study that we've carried out comparing methods. And then we're going to talk about what we believe to be good practice and recommended practice in various aspects of actually implementing a method of this kind on your survey. So I am going to begin with an overview of currently available methods. And then I'll be handing over to Nathan to talk about our experiment, and then to Nzanthla to talk about best practice. So first of all, the overview of currently available methods. So there are a number of well-established methods available for carrying out within household selection, which have to a large extent been well tested and developed in the context of face-to-face interview surveys. And I think we know quite a lot about the relative performance of different methods in that context, and we know a bit less in the self-completion context. So when it comes to the self-completion context, what we're looking for is a method which, on the one hand, should give us a good representative random sample of people in some sense, but on the other hand, is not so complex that people will carry out the selection incorrectly, because there's no longer an interviewer there to administer the selection. We're relying on the household members to do this for us. And we also don't want the method to be so burdensome or so intrusive that it'll put people off from taking part in the survey at all. So it's that balance between having something that is effective and something that is actually feasible and operational that we're looking for. Now, if we're carrying out a purely web survey, then obviously we can use the survey instrument to do the selection for us, and we have more options available. And it's fairly easy to ask someone to just enter, let's say, the initial of each person in the household, and then the script will automatically select one of them, and we'll tell that person we'd like the person with a name beginning with D to carry out the survey. So that's fine if you're doing a web-only survey, but we have reached a point where I think for self-completion surveys, at least of the general population in the UK, recommended good practice is to combine a web survey with a paper self-completion survey if you want a self-completion survey. So we need to find a selection method that will work on paper as well as online. So that imposes additional constraints on what we can do. So I'm just going to run you through available methods. There are a number of types of method. The first is what we shall refer to as birthday methods. So these are methods where we ask for the person in the household either with the next birthday or the last birthday or the nearest birthday to the current date to be the person to take part in the survey. So it's a relatively simple concept to convey to the respondent. Hopefully, in most cases, not too difficult for the respondent to work out who that person is. And then that's the person who should complete the questionnaire for us. Secondly, we could try to implement a pure random selection of a person within a household. The Kish grid method was probably the first method developed intending to do just that, and there have been very many variants of that developed since 1948 when Kish's paper came out. And of course, it doesn't have to be one person. You could do a random selection of two people or any other number, depending what you're looking for. So random selection is our second category of methods. Another possibility is to ask all eligible adults in the household to complete the questionnaire. So there is no selection, and it avoids the question of how do you select a person. And it is still random because everyone has a conditional probability of 1 of being asked to take part in the survey once we've sampled the household. Then there are methods that have been implemented on quite a few surveys where we ask for up to a certain number of people in the household to participate. So it could be up to 4, up to 3, or up to 2. Those are the main possibilities. And this is not a random method. We allow the house, any 2 or any 3, whatever, in the household to participate. So I'm just going to run through the pros and cons of these different possible methods. And there are quite a lot of them. I don't expect you to take in this slide all at once. I'm just going to run through these kind of one factor at a time. So the first thing that distinguishes these methods is obviously that the first 2 categories, the birthday method and the Kish grid or random selection method, can be used to randomly select 1 person per household, whereas the other ones result in more than 1 person being selected, at least in those households that have more than 1 person. So that introduces a level of within household clustering into our sample, which brings with it a design effect due to people in the household being more similar to one another in many respects than people selected at random from the population. So our effective sample size will be smaller than our actual responding sample size for that reason. That's one thing to bear in mind. On the other hand, the advantage of selecting more than 1 person per household is that it can be a relatively cost-effective approach. For sending out 1 mailing, you might get 2 respondents rather than 1. So that's the first distinction to bear in mind between the methods. Another distinction is that if you use a random selection method like Kish Grid, or you ask for everyone in the household to take part, those are genuinely random methods, and you have a genuinely random sample. Birthday methods are quasi-random. It's not quite a random method because people are not allocated birthdays purely at random. Now, the extent to which that matters may vary between surveys. It depends firstly on your data collection period. If you have your fieldwork randomly spread over 12 months of the year with a random sample in each month, then you kind of get a random sample of the distribution of possible birth dates in the year. But if you're doing your survey in a 1 or 2 month period, then your sample will be slightly skewed towards people who've had a birthday recently at that point in the year or are about to have their birthday at that point in the year. Whether that matters obviously depends on whether birth date is correlated with anything you're measuring in your survey. But there certainly are some topics for which there is a correlation, and that may matter. There are others where correlations are so low that it may not matter. So again, that's just something to bear in mind depending on what you're trying to measure in your survey. Obviously, the bottom 2 categories of methods where we're just allowing people to choose any 2 or 3 people in the household to take part are not random. They're not probability-based methods. But the thing to bear in mind is that in smaller households, they are random because everyone is eligible to take part. So if you think of the any 2 method, for example, where we ask any 2 people to take part, all the households that only contain either 1 or 2 eligible adults, that is a random method because they're all eligible. It's only in the larger households where an element of non-random selection is introduced. So that's the area where we might focus our attention in terms of how representative are those people in larger households. Next thing, things highlighted in turquoise now this time, is that there are some differences in terms of how easy or difficult it might be to explain some of these methods. The up to 2 or up to 3 are actually very easy to explain. There's no complex selection mechanism that people have to go through. And as I've already alluded to, they can be quite cost effective because you can get 2 or 3 respondents effectively for the price of one mailing. So that's one thing they do have in their favor. One thing we're concerned with, though, is that the way that these methods work in theory is not always exactly the way they work in practice. So methods where we undertake some kind of random selection, Kish grid method, next birthday, whatever, they run the risk of not always be implemented correctly. And in some cases, the incorrect person in the household will respond to the questionnaire, either deliberately because that's the person who's motivated to respond, or by accident because they haven't understood our instructions correctly. But for whatever reason, it happens. Another thing we can be concerned with, particularly with the any 2, 3, or 4 methods, is that if we are offering a conditional incentive for taking part, which we often do, and we think is good practice, that does offer people an incentive to sort of fictitiously make up additional household members in order to get an additional incentive. So, for example, somebody living alone might, pretend there are 2 people in the household, fill in the questionnaire twice and get 2 incentives. So there is this possible risk of fraudulent response, if you like, which again is something we need to be concerned about, and we need to think about how we can try to minimize the extent to which that happens and try to identify when it has happened, if it has. So that's broadly a quick overview of all the methods available. In the UK at the moment, the NE4 and the NE2 method seem to be used on quite a few surveys. NE2, even though it's not probability based for all of the sample, as I said, it is for a lot of the sample, and it is cost effective. And the birthday methods, as I've said, although in theory they're quite easy to explain, and it's a quasi-probability method, we know from methodological studies that there's actually quite a high degree of non-compliance. So in those households where this does actually involve a selection, households with more than one person, in quite a high proportion of cases, it's not the correct person who responds. So the task really in choosing a method is to think carefully about the ways in which each of these methods can depart from random sampling to some extent. They all do to some extent, whether it's because the wrong person is filling it in, or because somebody is fraudulently filling it in, or because we're allowing a non-random selection in larger households. To what extent does that matter? To what extent does it affect our data, and how does that influence our decision? So, let me just talk a little bit about those elements of non-random representativeness in our sample that we might be introducing with these different methods, just so we have an idea of what it is we're talking about. So with the next birthday method, as I said, the issue is that potentially the sample of the distribution of birthdays in our sample may not reflect the population unless our fieldwork is evenly balanced over 12 months. What happens is, depending on how our fieldwork is managed, our distribution of birth days, what I'm showing you here is the distribution of birth months, will vary somewhat. So if you have a nice 12-month evenly managed fieldwork period, you'll get a distribution of birthdays that's fairly even, like the top left-hand graph here. If you carry out your field work over a shorter period of time, you'll have a more skewed distribution, and it'll be more skewed the shorter the field work period. So what we've just simulated here to give you an idea of what the distribution might look like, in the top right-hand corner is the distribution of birth months that you might get if you have a 6-month fieldwork period for your data collection. And bottom right-hand corner is what you might get if you have a 3-month fieldwork period, and you can just about see that it's a bit more skewed if you do that. So there's a bit more of a difference between the peaks and the troughs. It's still not hugely different, but it's not the same as the even distribution that you would observe in the total population. And as I've said, whether that matters depends how much that's correlated with your survey measures. On the other hand, if we just think about the NE2 method, because that's arguably the most common of the NEN methods that are used, as I've said, the selection is completely random for the 1 and 2 person households. For the 3-person households, if you think about it, what happens is that in a proportion of cases, the people who self-select into the survey just happen to be the ones who you would have randomly selected anyway. And what if you run through the maths, as I've kind of done on this slide here, you can see that actually what should happen over a whole set of three-person households is that both of the people who respond will turn out to be the ones who you would have randomly selected in one-third of the cases. One of them will be correct in two-thirds of the cases. It's not possible for neither of them to be correct if you're selecting two out of three. Okay, so overall, that means that about two-thirds of the people who respond are the correct respondents. So it's only the other third that might potentially be introducing some bias and messing up the representativeness of your sample. And you can do the same calculation for households of other sizes. The expression for that is here on the slide. And if you work through all those numbers, what you see is that in the end, across the whole sample, given the distribution of household sizes in the UK, about 88% of the respondents will be the ones who would have been selected in a random sample. So you've got 88% of your sample is a random sample. The other 12% are people who should not have been selected if you had used a random mechanism, and they may or may not have characteristics that differ. So that's just to give you an idea of the scale of the thing, where it's easy to think, oh, any two, that's not random, can't possibly use that, it's not good. Well, actually, it is perfectly random for 88% of your sample. So we're not that far away from random, and it's not obvious that the 12% non-random is worse than the proportion of people who are the wrong respondent using next birthday, or even something like Kish Grid if you try to get people to administer that themselves. So that's our context for saying that we really need to carefully evaluate the relative merits and the effects of these different methods. So, sorry, did I just skip on two slides? I don't know how to go back now. I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to Nathan to introduce our experiment.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I will share my slides now. Okay, so slide should be clear now. Okay, so thanks for the intro, Peter. So given the context, so we set out to experiment with two of these methods that Peter described. Again, we chose two of the methods that we thought would be the most realistic to use in the UK context. They are implemented now by a few surveys, and also the two common methods that can be implemented for web and paper surveys specifically. So we implemented an experiment in England, Wales, and Scotland, testing the relative merits of any two method and next birthday. And I'll go over the background of the design and the results. We did this over the summer in the past year. We used a pared down version of the ESS 12 source questionnaire that takes around 20 to 25 minutes to complete. We were targeting around 1,000 completions in each group for next birthday and any two. We used sequential designs. So that means we send the paper questionnaire at the second reminder only in a sequence of reminders. We followed what is kind of what we refer to, I guess, as the ESS standard self-completion approach. So one invitation plus 3 reminders. Aside from the second reminder, all the letters give access to complete the web survey. In the invitation envelope, there's a £5 cash note given to all addresses as an unconditional incentive, and then £10 conditional voucher given on completion of the questionnaire. We used university branding on the letters and envelopes, and we varied the envelope sizes across the mailings. And also, I should mention for anyone who isn't familiar, the ESS is a social attitudes and behavior survey. So it has questions measuring the attitudes and behaviors of general public, spanning topics of trust in others, trust in institutions, attitudes towards the government, well-being, immigration, and many other topics. So diving into the specifics of the implementation for the two approaches, for next birthday, we're requesting that the person aged 18 plus, that is the eligible population for the survey, 18 plus. We request that the person 18 plus with the next birthday participates. The instructions for doing so are on the invitation letters, invitation and reminder letters, the cover pages of the web and paper questionnaire as well. £5 note in the envelope, £10 on completion. We also had check questions at the beginning of the survey, both in web and paper, to ask if the person completing it is the person with the next birthday. There's some literature on this that it boosts compliance with the method. And we also had in the household grid dates of birth for the respondent and all household members. So we could, after the survey was done, we could estimate how often the person with the next birthday actually completed the survey. For any two, we requested up to 2 adults, 18 plus participate. Similarly, the instructions were on the invitation letters and the cover pages of the web and paper questionnaire. There were no check questions though in that group. Same incentive approach, except to be clear, we only sent one £5 note to each address, but we offered £10 to each for each completion. We also did send a targeted reminder to households when we got one response, but they did the survey and they wrote in the survey that more than one adult lives there. And then we would send a targeted reminder saying, we got one response from you. Can we please get the second adult to participate? So we would replace the second or the third reminder with that targeted reminder text. When we sent out the paper questionnaires in any two, we would send 2 paper questionnaires out to all addresses, or one if only one, if already one adult had completed. And we assumed that we'd get 1.4 completions per address, which is what similar surveys get. Now, importantly, we incorporated a factorial experiment of 2 different letter designs. And this was a useful thing to do because the key information for these methods are in the letters. So depending on the design of the letter, you might get different results. To just describe the 2 components or aspects of the letters that we used. So we had what I'll refer to as the TDM letter, that's the tailored design method. The ESS collaborated with Don Dillman, who's an author of that book, to design these letters, and it's based in the principles of social exchange theory. Places a large focus on the scientific random nature of the selection, the topics at the beginning of the survey. So there's a link between the recruitment materials and the survey, why participating is important, and some other aspects that you can find in the tailored design method. And also, it's designed to look more like an official letter or memo that's coming from the sponsor, in this case, the 2 universities, Essex and City, St. George's. And then we also have the RCS letter, so that's respondent-centered surveys, which was co-written by Laura Wilson, who we collaborated with to design those letters. This style places more of a focus on accessibility. So there's subheaders, and it highlights more important information via color coding. It also uses relatively simpler language to achieve a lower grade level of readability. So the goal there is to write all the text so that I think it's grade 9 is the reading level that is sought to achieve. Here are the examples of or screenshots of the final letter version. So the left 2 were used for next birthday, the right 2 for any 2. On the left, in both pairs, is the respondent-centered surveys version. So you can see there are the subheaders. There's the big color-coded bar in the middle that kind of diverts attention to how to complete the survey. And then on the right in the two pairs is the TDM, tailored design method version. Just to go over some motivation for the experiment, Peter went through a bit of this already, but well, he discussed it for the width and household selection experiment. And I mean, so for the letter design experiment, the motivation was just that experimental quantitative evidence for letter design is pretty sparse in general, but especially in the UK. However, for self-completion surveys, it is one of the primary tools for convincing people to participate. Both design principles or frameworks are common in the UK. I would say that the RCS designs that are more similar to the RCS version are more common. Accessibility is a really important topic that we're always talking about in the scientific team at the ESS and among survey methodologists. So we want to know, does the accessible version of the letter actually work better? And then, as I explained, the design of the letter may impact the width and household selection method, which was the priority experiment in a sense. For the research questions, so you can imagine what these were. We want to know which width and household selection method performs better generally, which has the higher response rate. It's the first research question. We're also interested to know the precision of the estimates in both groups and to know the design effects, overall design effects for both methods. Once we figured out the design effects, third research question is which method is cheaper? We also want to know generally, does the next birthday method, which is more probability based in theory, yield a more representative sample? So we looked at sample composition, and then also were there any significant differences in the distribution of answers? Moving on to the results. So I've just included the raw numbers here at first. We achieved in the top table around 1,000 plus interviews, complete and partials together for each within household selection method, and then around 500 to 600 in each cell of the 4 conditions. Just to note, I include here the gross sample of individuals. So we started out with the gross sample of addresses, and then to estimate the gross sample of individuals, we multiplied the gross sample of addresses in any 2 by 1.655, which is the average number of adults in households in Great Britain, according to the census. Whereas in the next birthday group, the sample of addresses is the sample of individuals because we only sample 1 person per address. Moving on to the rates, so the response rates at household level, there was no significant difference in the response rate for the within household selection methods on aggregate. That's the top table. But there was a significant difference at the individual level. So basically, we don't get enough of the second adults in any 2, and overall at the individual level, the birthday method does have an individual level response rate. But moving to the second table below and looking at the differences by the letter version, we did see that the TDM letter got a significantly higher response rate, both at the household level and the individual level. And that didn't matter which within household selection method was used. So for both methods, the higher response rate for TDM was observed. It was a little higher. The difference was a little bigger in the N2 group, but about a percentage point, so that would be significant. And then of the 4 cells, I'm looking at the bottom table and the column to the furthest right, the highest response rate that we received was 39.5% in the next birthday and TDM group, and the lowest one was 28.4% in the NE2 and the RCS group. So a pretty big difference between those 2 cells. And a slight note, this is the APOR response rate for formula. So we're using completes and partials and adjusting ineligibility for the ineligibility rate from a recent face-to-face survey. Okay, so moving on, digging a little deeper into the mode breakdown. So across the 2 within household selection approaches, we didn't see a significant difference in the proportion of responses that we received on paper. Overall, for next birthday, that was 21.2%. It was 22.7% in 92. The difference wasn't significant, but looking at the factorial elements, the TDM letter did end up with more paper. They got more responses in both modes, so you can look at the raw numbers for web and paper, and for both within household selection methods, the TDM letter always got more completes in both modes, but the proportion of paper was significantly higher for the TDM letter. So it was a little more effective at getting people who prefer to participate on paper. The TDM letter also resulted in more effective implementation of both approaches. So looking at so-called process indicators on the left, have the percentage of respondents that did actually have the next birthday based on the data we got in the household grid. So that was a significant difference. 74% of respondents, we knew they had the next birthday in the TDM letter group compared to 70% in the RCS group. So for next birthday, there was some better implementation or in terms of process for the TDM letter group, and then also found the same thing in NE2 in the sense that we more often we got the second adult when the TDM letter was used. On average, we got 1.5 adults for the TDM letter and 1.4 adults, 1.42 in RCS letter. Moving on to the results. So first, costs, design effects and costs. So we did find that the overall design effect was larger for NE2. This is because there was some clustering of attitudes within households, and that resulted in a higher net effective sample size for the next birthday method overall. But nevertheless, there were still sufficient savings for NE2 to make it a notably cheaper method. We saved a lot on unconditional incentives and then also a little bit on postage. So overall, the NE2 group was around £4.50 cheaper per effective complete or partial interview. Looking at the breakdown by all four conditions, this finding was stable. The gap closed a little bit when the TDM letter was used. It was a little wider when the RCS letter was used, but the NE2 method is still cheaper for both, regardless of which letter version you use. I've highlighted in green the cheapest method, so NE2 and TDM letter was the cheapest method overall. Kind of notable that when we used the TDM letter and the next birthday method, it was actually cheaper than if we used the NE2 and the RCS letter. So you can see that the TDM letter is really doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the response rate. Moving on to sample composition. So we looked at four variables for this. We looked at sex, citizenship, education, and age. For sex and citizenship, there was no significant differences between the four groups. You can see that. So I should explain for the next few slides. We have in the first column the next birthday and the TDM letter. Then we have the next birthday and the RCS letter, the NE2 method and the TDM letter, NE2 RCS letter. So in the second column there, the next birthday and RCS letter had the best sex representation, but it wasn't statistically significant difference across the four cells. You can see that the confidence intervals in the parentheses there are comfortably overlapping, and no difference in the proportion of citizens, which was also very close to the benchmark, which is the column all the way on the right on the screen. For age, we did see that the NE2 and RCS letter group, the one all the way on the right, had the worst representation of the lowest age group, 18 to 24, which is a group that we traditionally struggle to include or get to respond to our self-completion survey, so it's a hard to reach group. and that combination of methods led to the worst representation of that group. Overall, the next birthday group did seem to achieve the best representation in terms of raw numbers. You can see 7.2, 7.5 in the first two columns versus 5.9 and then 2.9. However, the difference between 5.9 for NE2 and TDM was not statistically significant compared to the next birthday estimates. Next slide. For education, there were no significant differences overall, but there was some moderation by the factorial elements, which makes the interpretation a little difficult. For the next birthday and RCS letter version, so that's the second column, we did see kind of the best representation of the second group here, which is people who have either lower or upper secondary qualifications. That's ISCED 2 and 3. And that's basically because this cell brought in was the most successful at bringing in ISCED level 2. But if you look at the NE2 group, this wasn't really the case, and actually the NE2 and TDM letter version did better with this group compared to the RCS letter. So we have some kind of conflicting findings there, and we were also a bit restricted at how we had to combine the categories to match it with the UK census. Overall, so if we sum up all the differences to the population benchmark, we can see that the NE2 and RCS letter group had the worst representation on aggregate, whereas the other three cells were basically the same. So some more suggestion that the cell that had the lowest response rate was maybe the survey that had the lowest quality. Lastly, moving on to the attitudes. So on aggregate, for next birthday and NE2, there were no significant differences between the two methods. I picked a handful of questions here that span different topics. So kind of the topics I mentioned before. And you can see for all of these that the confidence intervals are comfortably overlapping. However, looking at the 4 cells, significant differences did occur. So I've circled the 3 questions here where that happened. That is satisfaction with the government, responsibility for climate change, and whether immigration is good or bad for the economy. You can see that the NE2 RCS group, so again, that's the lowest response rate, and that's the dark blue. That point and confidence interval is far enough from some of the other cells to be a significant difference. And digging in a little more specifically, so for the specific questions, we can see for the question now thinking about the British government, how satisfied are you with the way it is doing its job? And also for regardless of whether you belong to a particular religion, how religious would you say you are? For both of those, there was a weakly significant difference in the mean scores between the letter versions when NE2 was used. So nothing on the within household selection method, but for the last one there on the bottom, would you say it is generally bad or good for Britain's economy that people come to live here from other countries? There was a strongly significant difference in the mean score between the letter versions when NE2 was used, and also between the within household selection methods when the RCS letter was used. So that's a little complex, but basically it was just the this group NE2 and RCS letter that had the lowest response rate was different than all the other cells. So if you focus on the bottom circle there, you can see the dark blue point is far enough away from the 3 other cells which are clustered together. So just a bit more evidence that the combination of those methods led to different results in the survey and potentially the least reliable survey approach. Conclusion. So overall, when we aggregated the within household selection methods together, there were little differences between them in terms of sample composition or uh, estimates of the attitudinal questions. But we did see some moderation by the letter version. I didn't mention this, but we did look at the precision of the estimates between the two methods, and there was no big difference. So that basically means that we can get greater precision with any two, because since it's a cheaper method, with the same budget, we could achieve a larger sample size, and that will outweigh the higher design effects that we saw with any two. The outcome of that is that when we use the TDM style letters, the NE2 method is around 10% cheaper than NextBirth and gives very similar outcomes. However, if we do use the RCS letters, NE2 is cheaper, but the choice of the selection method may actually impact the survey estimates and also the sample composition. And then on the letter design, although it's not the goal of the point of this workshop, the outcome there is that the TDM style letter did outperform the RCS letter in terms of response rate and other process indicators. And although we didn't see many differences in the sample composition, it did seem like the TDM did achieve a more representative sample. So that's it for my presentation. I'll just give it back to chair the workshop.
Thank you, Nathan. I am going to, do you want to stop sharing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my slides. Okay. Yes, so I am going to present on the best practices for selecting individuals within households in self-completion surveys in the UK. Now, just a bit of background about survey features. So this whole project is part of a wider research project on delivering a step change in collecting data in the UK. You can see more details, the link at the bottom of the page. So this is just a part of the project. Now, this is the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So a bit of a background really is about the transitioning from face-to-face, from interviewer-led data completion to self-completion. And then look at the aims and scope. So the aims really are for the whole project in some ways that looks at the review of the evidence that we looked at, and also how we're developing some of the findings, also how we're developing the practice guides that we are going to talk about. We'll think about the methods that we used, and the primary focus really would be looking at how to choose selection method, plus also how to implement those methods and what is good practice. And then we'll just draw some conclusions from there. Now, as a bit of a background, more recently, there's been really a shift from interviewer-led data collection to self-completion. This is partly due to some declines that we've seen in response rates, plus also the rise in costs in terms of fieldwork, but also technology advances that have come in that have sort of changed the landscape of how data is collected. Now, this transition was exacerbated in terms of pace by the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, with a shift now towards self-completion methods. Now, one of the issues that comes up in relation to within household selection is when it comes to individual sampling frames when they're not available, we then have to use address-based sampling frames, which makes it complicated or slightly difficult when we're doing self-completion surveys, because these tend to be, we have to select individuals without having the list of names of people to select from. So there's no named list. When that happens, the responsibility of selection then rests with sampled households. Now, organizations, then sub-organizations, have limited control over the sampling of individuals and those circumstances. This has some implications in terms of what happens in practice, because then we need to know how best then to select individuals within those households. Plus also we need to identify effective methods for conducting those selections, and also evaluate the trade-offs that we have to think about between the different approaches that are available. The aim really for the overall project on within self-selection is to summarize current practices of selection within the UK for self-completion surveys, evaluate their performance in terms of between the different methods for those surveys that don't use interviewers, and ultimately is to develop a good practice guide for practitioners, agencies, and other stakeholders. And this will be the main context of, so this will be in the context of paper, online, or mixed mode surveys, plus also surveys that use address-based sampling frames, as we do in the UK. Now, just an overview of the approach that we took to do the project. It was, we wanted to get information from sub-agencies about the data relating to surveys that they conducted over the period from January 2019 up to, it was 2024, late 2024. And these surveys that we were interested in were large self-completion surveys, large-scale self-completion surveys. But we also reviewed some literature to look at experimental evidence that compared different within-house selection methods. These as well were focusing primarily on self-completion surveys, and also those that used address-based sampling frames. Now, what we found in the UK, this is just a distribution of the surveys that we looked at. So it's just a sample of those surveys. And in total, there were 86 surveys that didn't use interviewers that were reviewed. You can see here that the among the most common ones, it was the one that looked at all adults and the NE2. Now, one of the issues that comes up in practice is that the up to 4 sometimes is classified as all adults in some of these surveys. But when we looked at these surveys in more depth, we were looking at ones that describe the method as the all adults or up to 4 in that distance. So that's why there's a distinction there between those between the up to 4 and the all adults. But the most common that we found was the up to 2 in the all adults method. Now, in terms of good practice, the first part that we need to think about is how to choose the method that you want to use for your survey. Now, there are several factors that we have to take into account in the process. I will address all these individually in the next few slides, but just in summary, you have to think about the sample representativeness and selection bias for your survey, respondent band and compliance, and think about the household distribution that does affect choices that people make when selecting the method. Plus also look at the survey mode that you're going to use for your data collection, consider the objective of the survey and your target population, plus also costs, because they play a huge part in terms of decisions that you have to make. Now, in terms of representativeness and selection bias, Peter has already covered some of these, so it's covering a bit of all ground. But we have for non-probability methods, these have high selection bias. and they do tend to present samples that are less representative. Then quasi-based methods, these have moderate bias, but they present slightly more representative samples than non-probability methods. And then we have the probability methods, which have minimal bias and are more representative and produce more representative samples. In terms of respondent burden and compliance with the probability methods, they are a bit more complex to try and conduct without field interviewers. And they have a high degree of burden, and then people will then tend not to comply with those methods. The quasi-probability methods, they have a bit of moderate burden to respondents, whereas the non-probability ones actually have the least burden on respondents. Another factor to consider is the household size. So when we that table shows just a distribution of the number of adults per household for the UK and also Great Britain. So this is based from ONS data, census data collected from the UK countries between 2020, census 2021, and the Scottish census 2022, and the Northern Ireland census in 2021. So it's an aggregate of the data from those census. So in terms of size, with where you have one person households, really there's no need for selection, because the respondent in the household that you contact will be the respondent. So it's just that person. So there's no need for selection in that instance. However, in larger households, it's a bit more, it's slightly more complicated conducting the selection, but methods that tend to simplify the process, though at some loss of some accuracy, are acceptable, in part because in the UK, as you can see, we have very relatively few households that have 5 or more adults, only about 4 to 5%. So you can lose some accuracy in terms of that selection process. Now, one of the other key things to think about would be what the objective for your survey is. If we're interested in household levy estimates, then we need to look at selecting all individuals in the household, be that individuals providing completing the questionnaire and providing responses as an individual, but you can then aggregate data from all those within a household to look at household estimates. Plus, also, if you are interested in intra-household variations, so we also just need to look at selecting fewer than all eligible individuals in the household. At least that, then you will have some clustering that occurs within those households, but you have some intra-household variation there. And then we have to consider the survey mode. Now, with for self-completion, the modes that tend to be used would be the web or mail or a mixture of mixed modes surveys that collect using web and paper. For web-only surveys, these they present. You are able to use more sophisticated approaches to select your respondent within a household. You can have some create a household roster and use some automated invitations to do that. Whereas for mail and mixed mode, it's a bit methods are a bit limited in terms of that. Essentially, we need to be able to use the same method between the different modes, whether you're collecting by paper or mail, by paper or web. So the method needs to be consistent. And now with the mail surveys, it's a bit difficult to be creative about how to select your respondent. So some of those methods that we use in the web won't necessarily apply to mail surveys. So when we're using mixed modes, then it has to be the method that can be conducted with mail. And then we have to consider survey costs. Probability methods, they have the highest design operational costs, and some of this might be to follow up with respondents for non-response, but they have the highest costs. Quasi-probability methods, they have moderate costs, where the non-probability methods would have the lowest cost. Now, when it comes to implementing the different methods, some of the recommendations really for implementing these selection methods apply across different approaches. So this is just an overview of what is common between the different methods. So in terms of the selection instructions themselves, we need to use clear and simple instructions. And these need to be included in the communications that you use. So the invitation letter, reminder letters, and also the questionnaire introduction. In terms of communication materials, Nathan has highlighted in his presentation that the recommendation is to use the tailored design method. That's based on the social change theory. And to also just use professionally designed letters with university or official sponsorship logos. These tend to tend to be trusted more compared to letters originating from other institutions. Letters should include multiple ways of accessing the questionnaire. So this includes the URL or QR code, and where whatever method you are using, design you are using, and paper questionnaires are used, this also needs to be included. Now, we also need to include information about the incentives that is offered for people for participation. Now, the other issue is the reminder strategy. Evidence has suggested that having multiple reminders does maximize participation. Typically, up to 3 reminders are used as standard, and where applicable, paper questionnaire is usually included with the second reminder. So these apply across different selection methods. Now, moving on to the birthday method more specifically. Now, this is appropriate when the survey is interested in only one respondent per household, or where the full probability selection method is impractical. Having said that, this approximates probability selection in some capacities. It's quasi-random and with low respondent burden. Now, one of the issues or the risks that come up is the selection accuracy for using this method. Studies have shown that this is range from in the mid-50s to mid-70s in terms of accuracy. This comes up in terms of recipients not being able to follow or read, understand the instructions, or they disregard the importance of the instructions, and not think that the selection process is important. Plus, also you do have instances where in some households, the selected person with a birthday might not be willing to participate, and then a more willing member of the household then completes the survey. Now, how it's implemented in practice really is to specify that only in the instructions to specify that only one person should complete the survey. Now, state the instructions clearly. For example, if you're sampling over 18s, just say adults aged over 18 with the next birthday should complete the method. Also, inclusion of a verification question in the survey that asks whether the person who's completing the survey is the one of the next birthday has actually been shown to improve accuracy, selection accuracy. BE, though, that it tends to reduce the response rates slightly. For quality checks, in order to check that the person who's completed is the right person to complete the survey, we do need to collect some data like the date of births for the person, for the people in the households as part of the household grid. And then we can check that is the correct person that has completed the survey. Now, as we've highlighted, we do have high instances of people not identified as the person with the next birthday completing the survey. When that happens, though, those incorrect selections, we should not discard or remove the responses. This will basically reduce the sample size, but also introduce some additional bias. So we'll return those incorrect selections. Moving on to the up to 2 method. Now, these are suitable when the aim of the survey is to collect multiple, to get responses from multiple respondents from a household. This might be to analyze intra-household variation for some surveys. That might be of interest. It reduces respondent burden in that it's operationally simple to do. Plus, also this can be used when you're seeking fieldwork efficiency, where you are having a reduced number of sampled households, as opposed to selecting just one from a household. So we're getting 2 respondents from one household. The limitations associated with this, of course, is that you have some selection bias in households with 3 or more eligible adults. Plus, also, you get some non-adherence within those households. Now, it is harder to get full participation in households where you are selecting multiple where you have multiple eligible members and they're selecting multiple people. So some will not respond. In terms of implementation, with this as well, keep the instructions simple, specify that you want up to 2 eligible adults to participate, and define the criteria for these. For instance, if it's adults age over 18, just state that in your instructions. Plus also, we can provide some guidance for households with more than 2 eligible adults within those. For instance, you specify that it's any 2 adults, so it can be any 2. So the 3-person household, you request for any 2, it will be just any 2. The other one, the second person might be self-selection between the other 2 respondents. Or you can specify that you want 2 adults with the most recent birthdays to complete the survey. Now, this combines birthday method with the up to 2 method, but it's a way of selecting, of guiding households on how to select people to participate. And also, when considering reminders, then now that we're selecting more than one, in the instance where we've received a first response from a household, when sending reminders, we might encourage the household to have the second adult participate. Some quick quality checks to be done. We include a screening questionnaire that verifies eligibility for the participants. Plus also to track the number of responses per household. With this, we need to be able to retain some of the information for people within the same household. So when it comes to using the data, we know which respondents were sampled from the same household. For the up to 3, and I've combined these, the up to 3 and the up to 4 methods, because some things are common within these. And they are similar to up to 2, but with some slight differences here. Now, those differences are in that for the up to 2 and up to 3, you have a higher respondent capacity per household. So we're now inviting 3 or 4 people to participate and potentially have more detailed information about intra-household data. Plus also it reduces selection bias in some degree, because now you are having you're selecting you are asking more people from a household to participate. And as we've noticed before in the previous presentations, that when it comes to the more people you request to participate from a household, the less selection bias results from that. Of course, as we've seen, we're not asking everyone from household to participate. It's just a selection of people. So it's 3 out of however how many people are in the household. So there is still going to be some degree of selection bias within that. And also you have increased non-adherence. Now that you're requesting even more people to participate, so there's a higher risk that some households will not have full participation. And also this presents the opportunity that there might be fraudulent responses where people in smaller households might present as if there are more people, they overstate the sizes of their households and for additional incentive. So that creates fraudulent responses. Now, in terms of implementation, this is brief because it's similar in so many ways to the up to 2. But in this instance, you have to state the limits of clearly state the participation limits for people you are inviting. So if it's up to 3 in the household, it's up to 3. If you're selecting up to 4, it's up to 4. We also need to have some corresponding number of access codes that are provided for respondents within those households. Plus also, if then we're sending reminders where we are using, we're including paper versions of the questionnaire, we need to send the appropriate number of paper questionnaires to those households. Now, of course, when we're using paper questionnaires, that adds costs to your survey in terms of printing and postage. But yes, we need to provide with the reminder, with the second reminder as practice, the additional paper questionnaires. We also need to do the quality checks in terms of looking at tracking the number of responses per address, that they do not exceed the response limits per address. The other method is the selecting all eligible respondents from within a household. Now, this is appropriate where if the interest is for your survey is about collecting information from all household members. You might be interested in household level data. Then you need responses from all members in the household. This minimizes the selection bias because you're inviting everyone in the household to participate. And there's no need for selection rules in this instance. It's just specifying your target is all adults in the household. And of course, this also increases non-adherence and also the opportunity for fraudulent responses in households with fewer, smaller households. In terms of implementation, with this here, we can distinguish between mail and mixed mode surveys, plus also web surveys. For the mail and mixed mode ones, the application is similar to the up to 4, in part because, as we've seen in terms of distribution of household size in the UK, it's only about 4% of households have more than 5 people or more in the household. So in practice, what happens is surveys that select more than 4 people that select up that say this, they use the up to 4 method. In essence, they tend to classify that as requesting information from all adults. But there is a small proportion of households that have more than 4 people. So in practice, when applying selecting all eligible respondents, they tend to use the up to 4 method. Now, this is done only really for mail and mixed modes. For web surveys, because you can be a bit more flexible in terms of the technology that you can use or the programming that can be used to conduct selection, web surveys are a bit more, it's more you can do in terms of selecting your sample. So in this instance, an initial invitation letter is sent to the household, but only with one login, and only one household member is asked to complete this. They will complete the household grid, and then they have access to their own questionnaire. Once they've completed that question, the household grid and the questionnaire, if there are more adults who are eligible to participate within that household, then what will happen is that there will be an on-screen message that would prompt the respondent to invite the additional adults in that household to participate. Now, this prompt will ask them whether they want to send this via email or print the invitation letter. So if an email is provided, an email invitation is going to be sent automatically to the additional household member with their unique access code to complete the survey. If they request for a printed invitation letter, a letter will be printed for the additional household member that has been identified. Now, the initial invitation for this really should not state whether people should not inform the participant, the initial participant, that there will be other additional household members will be invited to participate. This, in part, we found that in a study where people are informed in advance that they are going to other members are going to be invited to participate, they overstated the size of the household. So if for that, then they'll gain additional incentives for it. So the advice, the recommendation is that not to state that additional members may be invited to participate. Now, just to draw some conclusions, really, I suppose what the review we found is that there's no method that is optimal in all contexts. And ultimately, the choice of a method requires a balancing of key trade-offs, whether trying to maintain probability-based selection, reducing the respondent burden, but also ensuring that your method is operationally feasible in terms of cost effectiveness, as well as ease of implementation. Ultimately, the choice also depends on what the survey objectives are, the household side, or also what mode you are using for collecting the data. And that's it really from me. I'll stop sharing my screen. And any questions?
Thank you very much to Peter, Nathan, and Santa for the presentations. If there are any questions, please put them in the chat or let us know if you would prefer to ask them yourselves and I can unmute you. In the meantime, maybe we can start with the first question that we have in the chat, and this is from Rory Fitzgerald. So his question is the NE2 approach now the recommended way forward for surveys of individuals in the UK using address-based samples? And does it depend on the clustering expected on the substantive questions in the survey? So whoever wants to take
which one of us would like to answer that?
Maybe you can all answer it.
Okay, shall I have a first go, and then others may have a view to express? I think the answer to that is based on all the evidence we have so far at the moment, that NE2 probably is the preferred method in general for general population surveys in the UK. But as I think Constanza said quite carefully, there's not a very big difference in our evaluation between the methods. The differences are minor, and it wouldn't take an enormous shift in some of the parameters to perhaps change the recommendation. And there are really two things that the recommendation depends on. One is the distribution of household sizes. Now, if anything, my guess is that in the relatively near future, household sizes are going to continue to get smaller, as they have done over the last couple of decades in the UK, not the opposite. But you never know, that could change. If household sizes start getting bigger, then that's a different consideration. And the other is the intra-household correlation. So if intra-household correlations are broadly at the kind of level that we observed on our study, then NE2 still comes out as being more cost effective. But if on a particular survey the intra-household correlations were much higher than that, then that might lead to a different conclusion, and you might think that a method that selects one person per household would be preferable to any two. And then if you want to select one, then I think we would say that next birthday is the best way of selecting one in a self-completion survey at the moment. I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that.
No, just I think the importance of the objective of the survey matters really. If, for instance, we are looking at ones where you've got quite a number of attitudinal questions, then the issue of clustering, yes, does play a part in terms of what might be the best method to use. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I mean, the results of our survey suggested that the NE2 method, when the like tailored design method ladder was used, it was cheaper and provided basically the same results. So
I have one other little thing to add, which is that this Survey Futures project on within household selection still has some outputs that it is yet to produce. And in the very near future, one of the things we're going to be producing is a good practice guide, which is going to appear on the website, which will reflect a lot of the things that Nsansa was summarizing just now in terms of survey practice. But the content of that isn't completely finalized. And the thing that just went through my mind when thinking about your question, Rory, is that we could actually do some sort of simulation calculations of how the balance of advantages would shift depending on the intra-household correlations. You have a little table that says if inter-household correlations, if you predict it's going to be higher than this, then at that point, next birthday might become more cost effective than any two. We can do that calculation and add that in as a bit of extra information.
Yeah, I think that would be very useful. I found your pros and cons tables very clear and easy to follow. Are there any other questions for our presenters? Everybody's taking notes, just making sure we don't forget this. Um, Anything else? Yep, there is another, not a question, but to say thanks for a very interesting digest of your findings. So I think this was very, very interesting and very useful, and also a lot of information. I want to thank our presenters very much. If you have any more questions, I'm sure you know where to contact Nathan, Peter, and Danta. And we will have a recording available of this workshop if you would like to go back over anything that has been presented today. So thank you very much for joining us, and I wish everyone a nice afternoon, and see you at the next Survey Futures workshop on Monday, I think. Thank you.
Bye. Yay. Thanks, Roxandra. Thanks for your help.
Sure.
Do you have any